today's video, we're going to take a look at how to get perfect exposure every time. I personally own and shoot with the Sony a7S Mark III and often film in ProRes RAW, but the principles that I'm going to be covering apply to just about any camera that films in a log or flatter picture profile. Whether you're just starting out or are a seasoned veteran, you know that there's almost nothing worse than getting home from a long day of filming, taking a look at your dailies and finding that your shots are either underexposed or overexposed. And if you spent time worrying about exposure while on set, you probably weren't focused on the most important thing, and that's the story that's unfolding right in front of you. In today's video, we're going to look at a few simple things to keep in mind to help you nail exposure every single time, even if you film run and gun documentary style projects like I do. For those of you that are new around here, my name is Riley and I'm a documentary filmmaker that likes talking about everything from filmmaking and creativity to faith. I'm also someone that likes to film on Sony cameras. So if any of that interests you, be sure to subscribe and follow along. All right, let's dive in. Now, the most common question that gets asked when it comes to exposure on the a7S Mark III or any camera for that matter is where do we put our skin tones? And this makes sense because skin tones are basically the fundamental building block of any scene, right? We tell stories about people, and so having those people exposed correctly is going to be the first thing that we're going to want to take care of and we're going to want to look at. Now, with the a7S Mark III, if you're filming in ProRes RAW or you're filming in one of the internal codecs and you want to film with something that has the most dynamic range, you're going to want to film with the S-Log3 picture profile. Now, S-Log3 is great because it captures a ton of dynamic range, but it's also a little bit tricky because it sets middle gray, which is halfway between white with no detail and halfway between black with no detail. It sets middle gray to 41% on a scale of 0 to 100. Now, normally you would expect middle gray to be at 50, but Sony has done this with the S-Log3 picture profile in order to allow for a little bit more detail in the highlights. So they've compressed the shadows just a little bit. Now, this isn't an issue at all because it allows for the most dynamic range, but what it means is that you're going to want to set your skin tones to just above middle gray. Now, most skin tones, whether pale or darker, are going to sit at or just above middle gray. So I would recommend setting skin tones anywhere from 45 to 55 on a waveform monitor or on your Zebras. Now, if you film with a little bit older of a Sony camera, something that doesn't have a 10-bit codec like the a7 III or the a7S Mark II, I would actually bump up your skin tones by maybe another stop or so because those cameras have a little bit more compressed of an image, and because of the shadow compression that I mentioned earlier, it's going to add some more noise to those images. So giving it a little bit more light and pushing down the shadows in post is probably going to be the way to go on most of those cameras. Now, I personally wouldn't worry a ton about noise with the a7S Mark III if you're filming at one of the base ISOs and you aren't underexposing the image, having to bring it up in post. Both the internal 10-bit codecs as well as ProRes RAW do a pretty good job of not being overwhelmed with noise from compression. Now, you might have to use a denoiser in post, especially if you're filming in ProRes RAW, but if you aren't underexposing and having to lift the shadows in post, you should be fine, and setting your skin tones somewhere between 45 and 55 is going to help you overexpose by about a stop and not have to worry too much about noise. Now, this next point I think is actually more important than where specifically you set your skin tones on a waveform, and that's your lighting ratios. And when I talk about lighting ratios, I'm talking about creating some contrast in your image where your subject is several stops different from your background. And if you can either light or compose your scene in a way that you have several layers going from light to dark to light again, or dark to light to dark again, you're going to create some really interesting and good looking images. And if you underexpose or overexpose something that's lit with really good contrast ratios and it's off by a stop or two, you're going to be able to fix it in post and be able to either pull the shadows down slightly or bring the highlights up slightly, because you have both shadows and highlights in the image to be able to work with and play around with. So I would definitely focus on getting some really good lighting and contrast ratios in your image and in your scene to where your subject is several stops different than your background. And if you can do something similar to what I'm doing in this scene of creating a little bit of contrast and some separation on my face, of having a couple of stops of difference on the shadowy side of my face, as well as another little highlight with the backlight, it's going to be something that adds some depth to your image and is going to help your exposure look that much better. The third tip that I want to share with you is to use your monitoring tools. If you're filming in ProRes RAW, you have an Atomos Ninja 5 to use that has some great monitoring tools. It has false color, it has a waveform monitor, and it has the PQ monitoring mode that allows you to view your S-Log3 image in HDR. And it's personally what I use along with the waveform monitor to be able to judge what my exposure looks like, what my lighting ratios look like, and it gives me a pretty good approximation of what the final image could look like. So go ahead and take a look around the Ninja 5 and use those monitoring tools. But if you don't have a Ninja 5 and you're just recording on the internal codecs, or you have a different camera, you probably have access to Zebra tools that you can program and use to figure out how your skin tones are exposed and whether or not your image is over or underexposed. Most mirrorless and video cameras at least have a histogram tool. That's definitely another good one that you can use as well. Remember, setting your exposure is a pretty subjective thing, and it's something that ultimately should help to serve the story that you're trying to tell. If you have a scene in your story that requires a pretty dark and moody and underexposed image, then do that and lean into it well. Don't let someone like me tell you to do it differently because it isn't the right or technical way to expose an image. Remember, we got into filmmaking to tell stories, inspire people, and hopefully to bring some truth into the world. Learning how to set your exposure is just another tool in your tool belt along the way. Be sure to let me know in the comment section below what camera you're using and what your favorite exposure tools are with that camera. I would love to hear from you. As always, thank you so much for watching, and if you found this video helpful, I would love it if you would consider subscribing as well as hitting the like button below. It really is the best way to help me support this channel. Thanks so much, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.